I'm Vin Weber, and I'll be the moderator of today's forum with Senator Joe Biden. First of all, just to reiterate, and for some of you who are not always here, today's session is being recorded for broadcast later on C-SPAN and by other news media outlets, in addition to which we have press in the audience. So for today's meeting, all comments by the speaker, by his questioners, and any untoward table conversation, you should be aware, are on the record. Again, we'd ask you please, out of courtesy to our speaker, to make sure you turn off your cell phones. And again, as the program will conclude promptly at 2 o'clock, we ask that you not leave early. I know you're all anxious to get immediately to the substance of today's address, so I'll be very brief. I think Senator Joe Biden of Delaware needs no introduction to this or to any other policy or political group in the United States. He is the United States Senator from Delaware, as he has been since 1972, and is now the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. Without much more introduction than that, let me just say a personal observation. First of all, in my time in the Congress for 12 years, it was with a great deal of respect that I viewed across party lines this leader in the United States Senate, and so I count it as a great personal pleasure to introduce him today. I also think at a time when our nation is challenged in a unique way, it's worth noting that the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, at a time when our foreign policy interests appear to be inextricably intertwined with domestic security interests as well, has as his second major interest in the Congress of the United States always focused on domestic security and crime. He is really uniquely positioned to be in the position he is in today. The chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Joe Biden.
Thank you very much, Vin. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm delighted you pointed out to all the questioners that they're on C-SPAN and it's live. That ought to cut down the questions. I turned to John Negroponte when they said we'll end at 2 o'clock prompt. I said, oh my God, I got an hour before this group. You are probably the most informed audience I'm likely to speak to on matters relating to foreign policy in this issue, which is somewhat daunting. So I'd like to ask you all a personal favor, as we say in the Senate, a point of personal privilege. My niece, Missy Owens, who went to Georgetown, then worked in the White House for a while, and is now up here at law school, is here as a guest of the council. And she is my goddaughter. Her sister, my best friend, has managed every one of my campaigns. Please do not embarrass me in front of her. If those of you who have nieces and nephews you're close to will understand that, and if you don't, well, then whatever company you're with, we'll have a problem. That was a joke, by the way, to the press out there. What I understand the deal is that you would like me to speak for a little bit and then open this to questions. Could I put that down there? And I will, my inclination in the times I've been able to speak before the council and had the privilege has been, and I mean this sincerely, it may be more useful one of these times just to come up and not make a speech and simply take questions. Because, as I said, I'm not being solicitous. I look out in this audience and the number of former ambassadors and high-ranking members of former administrations and the academic prowess that exists in this room on foreign policy matters is exceeded by none, at least any group that I've spoken to. And I would likely learn a heck of a lot more from just your questions. But the deal is, I'm to speak and you're to listen. And if you all finish your job before I finish mine, raise your hand and we can all go home. When I accepted the invitation to speak here today, I fully expected that I would be talking about the ABM Treaty and about our military priorities in the context of an evaporating budget surplus, or about missile defense versus the more urgent threats that we could face and now, in fact, do face. I thought the question I might be asked would be about our strategic doctrine, about relations with traditional adversaries like Russia and China, and whether the Yankees will win the World Series. That's the only one I have the answer to. The answer is yes. And I certainly did not, for one instant, think we'd be here today wondering about short and long-term goals in a war against terrorism, whether we will succeed, how long it will take, what constitutes victory. But those are, in fact, the questions facing the United States, and I confess I have no easy answers to any of them. First, our immediate goal is to cut off the head of al-Qaeda, break up the network, leave them no safe haven. That means, to state the obvious, the removal of bin Laden, Mullah Omar, and the Taliban leadership. I don't know how long it will be before the regime is toppled. I wouldn't want to guess, but it seems to me the handwriting is on the wall, as they say. They've lost the support of their key sponsors, and they're essentially isolated. But some of those sponsors may need reminding that they've got to make a clear break with the past, now and in the future. And we should not hesitate to spell that out to those sponsors. After al-Qaeda and the Taliban fall, to use the phrase of the day, when we drain the swamp, as the president says, the medium-term goal is to roll up all al-Qaeda cells around the world. Then, with the help of other nations and possibly the ultimate sanction of the United Nations, our hope is that we'll see a relatively stable government in Afghanistan, one that does not harbor terrorists, is acceptable to the major players in the region, represents the ethnic makeup of the country, and provides the foundation for future reconstruction of that country. In the long term, our goals are very easy to articulate, but they're very much more difficult to achieve. We need to deter any potential state sponsor of terrorism from providing support or a haven to future bin Ladens. We'll work with others and try to help rebuild a politically and socially stable Afghanistan that does not export terrorism, narcotics, or a militancy to its neighbors and to the wider world, more like it was in the 1950s and 60s without a monarchy. We'll need to stabilize Southwest and Central Asia to prevent the Talibanese making like a Taliban state, Pakistan, and other countries in the region. As the old joke goes, we think we have a problem now. Imagine with the Taliban in control of Pakistan and nuclear weapons. And we'll need to address some of the economic and political forces that can be manipulated by men like bin Laden. We must do this with a full awareness that attention to social and political development alone won't prevent another bin Laden from emerging, but at least it will severely limit the pool from which he can draw recruits and support. If we're successful in prosecuting this effort in Afghanistan, and it ups the ante for other nations harboring and sponsoring terrorism, both directly and indirectly, in my view, it makes it more difficult for other nations to contemplate the continuation of some of the actions that they are engaged in now, or increasing their support. The president believes, and I agree, that we must stay involved in the region, not necessarily with American troops, but with American leadership and significant American resources after the initial job is done. The president has repeated many times, and it's important that we say it over and over again. This is not a war against the Afghan people or any one faith. This is a war between nation states and the transnational terrorist organizations that have made this a choice between civilization and chaos on one side and nation states in order on the other. We need to remind the world's 1.2 million Muslims, the vast majority of whom are sickened by the attempt at hijacking of their faith, that our fight is with bin Laden and al-Qaeda and not with them. American policy has long been marked by a blend of a Wilsonian trend and realpolitik. But whatever our motive, it has not been guided by religious imperatives. When we sought to bring peace and stability to the Balkans, the Muslims in Bosnia and Kosovo were the primary beneficiaries. When we went into Somalia, our aim was to feed starving people who happened to be Muslims. And when we provided $170 million in humanitarian assistance to the Afghan people in the last year, it had to do with our principles, and the people there happened to be Muslim. Unfortunately, we have done a terrible job in disseminating this and other information. We have to take a fresh look, in my view, at our public diplomacy and determine the most effective ways we can get out our message. But I'm under no illusions. Winning the hearts and minds of ordinary citizens of the Islamic world will be an uphill battle, but one we have to undertake. We must enhance the means we use as well as the message, whether it's people-to-people visits to explain our principled respect for diversity of all faiths and cultures, or a significant investment in radio and television assets to inform and ultimately empower moderate Muslims in the region. What we cannot do is let the Taliban wage the same propaganda war Saddam Hussein has waged in Iraq, with photographs of mothers and children scrambling for food and endless footage of destroyed buildings, all designated to portray us as anti-Islam, anti-Arab, because that is not our motivation, but it is a very powerful tonic in the region and left without any counterbalance. Regardless of whether we succeed in getting our message out, the truth is we cannot and certainly will not walk away from 7 million displaced, desperate Afghanis, surviving on little more than grass and locust. We must do more to help the Afghan people, and we must do far more to make our aid visible to the entire Muslim world. I'm reluctant to use the word nation building because it is such a loaded political term these days. But if we leave Afghanistan in chaos, it will be another time bomb waiting to explode. And there's an enormous powder keg right next door in Pakistan. As I said earlier, if we think we have a problem now, imagine a nation 6 times the population of Afghanistan with a nuclear arsenal and a government that reflects the one that now exists in Afghanistan. To avoid that scenario, we have to work with the World Bank, the IMF, the UN, and other NGOs and our allies, especially those in the region, to help build an infrastructure in Afghanistan that works. The United Nations Secretary Kofi Annan said it will take nearly $600 million just to get Afghan refugees through the winter. But that, in my view, is only the very beginning of the effort that's going to be needed. In the long term, Afghanistan will need to find a way to break the hold that the madrasas have had on a generation of young men. They will need to educate a generation of young women to give them the tools necessary to seize the rights so cruelly denied them under the Taliban and that did exist in the 50s and 60s. They'll need to demine the most heavily mined nation in the world. They'll need crop substitution programs to rid themselves of the title of the world's foremost producers of heroin and opium. And they'll need wells, water purification centers, hospitals, village clinics, even simple roads that link one town to the next. I commend the President for promising $320 million in Afghan aid. In my opinion, this might be the best investment we make. I say this notwithstanding that many obstacles to achieving these goals that exist in the region that have not proved susceptible to our entrees and have provided incubators for terrorism, but not incubators for democracy. Clearly, we're not going to be able to do this job alone, and I have to acknowledge at the front end, it's problematic whether the job can be done at all. But I see no alternative but to try. Our interests are furthered when we meet our international obligations, keep our treaties, and engage the world. Far from the black and white of campaigns and up against the gray of governing, it is much easier to see the virtues of multinationalism and the shortcomings of unilateralism. The same tools we use to build this coalition may, in the long term, help change the dynamics of bilateral relations and present real and unexpected opportunities in this new century. And by the way, it is my view the administration has figured this out and has moved promptly to distance itself from its initial unilateralist views. Where the administration may have once been tempted to see only strategic differences with China over national missile defense in Taiwan, today there's a growing recognition that we have a common strategic interest as well, like fighting terrorism and maintaining peace and stability in Central Asia. Where the administration may have once seen relations with Russia through the prism of the Cold War, today the promise of entering into a fundamentally different relationship with the Russian Federation is literally possible. Where the administration may have once viewed relations with Iran within the confines of a 20-year time warp, today Iran has signaled a desire to at least explore a relationship based upon newly defined common interest. They've even said they would assist in the search and rescue operations of downed American pilots. I don't mean to suggest that there's going to be a metamorphosis in Iran and/or our relationship will change overnight, but there is a new opportunity. Clearly, there's an internal rift in Iran. The reformists would like to go further. All they could get through the system was this modest gesture. But because the system operates on consensus, I'm virtually certain Khomeini approves, which is very significant in and of itself, in my view. Let's not be under any illusion that there will be a full-blown rapprochement with China, Russia, and Iran. But if we do this right, if we look at our adversaries in a new light, there will be much to build off in the future. This weekend, the President was in Shanghai for the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. He met with China's leaders, who now see more clearly than ever the threat posed to them by the proliferation of nuclear, chemical, and biological, and even ballistic missile technology. I guarantee you that Jiang Zemin, in my discussions with him, could very easily imagine a plane crashing into an 80-story office tower in Shanghai, as well as the World Trade Tower here in this great city. I expect that China's leaders will never think of their nuclear and ballistic missile exports to Pakistan in quite the same way. Whether they'll end it and how they'll curtail it is another question, but they will not think of it in the same way. Working with China against terrorism, however, does not mean jettisoning our concerns about China's human rights record or overlooking proliferation. In fact, we may need to remind China's leaders that respect for human rights and religious liberty in China's Muslim minorities is not only morally right, but also essential if we are to deprive the terrorists of their recruits. In Russia, President Putin has emerged as a strategic thinker who thinks that in order for Russia to advance in the ranks of highly developed nations, he must cast his lot with the West. He recently said, and I quote, "Today we must firmly declare the Cold War is over. I have no doubt that U.S. leadership and President Bush will do their best so that the peaceful population does not suffer, and that they are already doing their best." End of quote. Putin is willing to confront and has confronted entrenched reactionary domestic opposition when necessary. He overruled his senior military, and he gave the green light for U.S. planes to overfly Russian territory and permit troops on former Soviet territory in Central Asia, actions virtually unimaginable not so long ago. We have a genuine opportunity to pursue a new relationship with Russia, and we should, if the news out of Shanghai this weekend is accurate. It may well be possible to reach an agreement on mutually limiting capabilities, offensive capabilities, and allowing tests of missile defense systems without jettisoning the ABM treaty, but amending it. I hope the President will resist those in his administration who would have him risk squandering this opportunity by withdrawing unilaterally from the ABM treaty. I have always said nations, like people, use crises to resolve differences or create new opportunities. In the case of Russia, we have a momentous opportunity, in my view. It may well be possible to deal not only on strategic forces, but also with NATO enlargement and our non-proliferation concerns. That new relationship could shape this half-century of the Cold War, shape this half-century as the Cold War shaped the last half-century. 3 days ago, Secretary Powell said in Shanghai, not only is the Cold War over, the post-Cold War period is also over. If the administration proceeds pragmatically rather than ideologically, the new era could be a good one, and a good one indeed. But let's remember that Russia is not the only country that matters in developing a new strategic doctrine. We must take care not to provoke a major Chinese arms buildup, which could lead to more nuclear arms in India and in Pakistan. We need the help of both in the war against terrorism, and nobody needs more nuclear weapons along that border, which is already getting much too hot for comfort. The time is right to consider joint efforts to reduce strategic arms, to commit to a joint program to combat terrorism, develop a bilateral plan to prevent other countries or terrorists from gaining weapons of mass destruction, to find ways to counter infectious disease epidemics and to clean up the residue left by our weapons programs. As a matter of fact, it seems to me it's time that we engage in what many of us have been calling for thus far, to spend $8 billion to gather up the bulk of the Russian chemical weapons stockpile that they need help on. It makes sense to follow the Baker proposal for a $30 billion 8-year commitment dealing with nuclear weapons in the former Soviet Union and Russia in particular. And we should do everything we can to help Russia stay in the path of economic and political growth and stability. Once the foundation of cooperation is firmly established, we can pursue missile defense if that's what he wants, without rocking the boat of strategic stability. Look, in the long term, even if the coalition that has now been put together breaks down, we'll have the potential opportunity to create new day-to-day relationships with those who we viewed before with great suspicion, including China and Russia, and maybe even with Iran. So in the short term, we want to eliminate bin Laden and his top aides and remove Mullah Omar and the Taliban leadership. In the medium term, we need to establish a relatively stable regime in Afghanistan, which will be incredibly difficult, and roll up al-Qaeda's cells around the world. And in the long term, we have to deter state sponsorship of future bin Ladens, help rebuild Afghanistan, and stabilize Southwest and Central Asia. What will be much more difficult will be to clearly identify and address some of the root causes of the hardcore, hate-driven zealotry so that we can limit the pool from which future bin Ladens will be drawn. The list of root causes is long, from the lack of legitimate channel of dissent in the Arab world to desperation to resentment at America's material success, to a perception that our actions don't match our ideals. All of these issues are worthy of our attention, but they can never be an excuse for terrorism, which brings me to Israel. Let me just say Israel did not produce bin Laden. If, in fact, Israel were excised to Mars tomorrow, bin Laden would not go away. He would have existed before, and he would exist after. And we can't let Israel become the scapegoat. We're in a tough stage right now, and there are many crosswinds buffeting our relationship with Israel. But our friendship with Israel is not a transitory event, not a marriage of convenience or a short-term alliance. Differences are normal even among our friends, and by airing them in public, it seems to me we make a mistake. Surely there are sufficient channels to communicate our views. Let's not create the false impression about the fundamental long-term basis upon which the Israeli-U.S. relationship rests. We continue to be bound by an unshakable shared view of democratic values and a long-term commitment born out of what had gone before. And so after all of this, the question remains, what constitutes victory over terrorism? If we cut off the head of al-Qaeda, help rebuild a stable Afghanistan, find a way to stabilize the relationship between Pakistan and India, more than a day's work, and enhance bilateral relations with China, Russia, and Iran, then we will have achieved a victory that may well define the 21st century. In sum, just as we could not have put together a viable coalition if President Bush, in my view, had already walked away from the ABM treaty, so too we will have trouble nurturing future bilateral relations if we decide when this crisis is over to go it alone again. We should be right now figuring out how we revive the CTBT, how we deal with start arms control proposals that go to START 3, environmental treaties, and how to amend and not jettison the ABM treaty. Before I take some questions, let me leave you with these final thoughts. On September 11th, the world changed. It changed utterly, as William Butler Yeats said in a different context. But it did not change our way of life. It will not change our way of life. I truly believe you'll be funding young scholars here at the Council 20 years from now, when they mark September 11th as a day that began the end of the ability of international, transnational terrorist groups to be able to operate with impunity, not the end of America's way of life. I believe it's the beginning of the end for that evil, not the beginning of the end of our way of life. Out of our dark grief, our nation is newly united. and abroad, we have opportunities that did not exist even 3 months ago. As my mother says, out of every tragedy, Joey, if you look hard enough, something good will come. Or in the words of another great Irish poet beyond my mother, Seamus Heaney, in his poem, The Cure of Troy, there's a stanza that says, history says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, that longed-for tidal wave of justice will rise up, and hope and history rhyme. I truly believe, notwithstanding the incredible difficulty we faced to do even half the things I mentioned here, that we're on the verge, if we do it right, of making hope and history rhyme. But we cannot squander this opportunity. I believe the President has made a genuine transition in his thinking on foreign policy. I hope I am not kidding myself. If he has, I think not only will he go down as a great president, I think it will mark the beginning of a new era in international relations. Thank you all for listening.
I'm instructed to screen questions, please. Thank you. It's my job to screen questions for the senator without trying to get too much between the questioner and the answer. Under the rules of these engagements, when I call on you, will you please stand up and state your affiliation and try to state your question as concisely as possible. To get things going, though, I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair and ask the first question. Senator, you talked at some length about some possibilities in terms of relationships, Iran, Russia, and other places. Talk about a place where there might be some strains. The American people, at least, are being fed a significant diet of negative information about our relationship with the Saudis and their relationship to terrorism over these past many years. Is there a deeper problem there than we thought, and how should the American people and the government think about that relationship?
I've been admonished to make the answers very, very brief, so I will make them brief. If you want me to expand, I will attempt to do that. Number one, I do not doubt the pressure that the Saudis are under, like other Arab states in the region, having to essentially buy off their extreme groups in order to maintain themselves. But the Saudis have gone above and beyond the call in destabilizing the region, in my view, in terms of them essentially funding a significant portion of what we are now dealing with in the extreme example of Islam gone awry. It's one thing to decide you're going to export Wahhabi Sunnism by setting up madrasas around the region. Okay, I get that. But what I don't get is setting them up where they have a third feature, that they are hate-filled, anti-American breeding grounds. I think we should have a very simple, straightforward discussion with the Saudis and understand that they have a hell of a lot more to lose in the breakup of the relationship than we have to lose. That is taking a great risk. I am not sanguine about the fact that we get 1.6 million barrels of oil a day from there. But I would be prepared, were I the Secretary of State or I in another position, to tell the Saudis, don't push it. Don't push it. Cease and desist from this activity. There will be consequences. Anyway, that's my view.
I'm Steve Robert of Robert Capital Management. As I listened carefully to your address, which I thought was very good, it seems the center of gravity in the debate over missile defense has changed. Because while the opponents of missile defense prior to September 11th would have just probably said it's a foolish idea and the wrong priority, what you seem to be saying is that it's almost inevitable if we also cut nuclear arms stockpiles, renegotiate the arms control treaty and the strategic arms treaty and so forth. So is this, in fact, what you mean to communicate, that we're now just talking about how we get to missile defense as opposed to whether we should have missile defense at all?
What I'm suggesting is, and it's a very good question, what I'm suggesting is we should be prepared to explore assuming we can amend the ABM treaty to do the exploration, whether or not a viable missile defense system is feasible without starting a new arms race and without producing an economic hemorrhage of $500 billion with little return on our investment. Right now, we're caught between the rock and a hard space. In order to go forward, according to this administration, I think they're inaccurate. But the gentleman sitting behind you has forgotten more about this issue than I'm going to know. But in order for them to go forward with the testing program they have in mind, they can do it without having to violate the ABM treaty. But it has become sort of religious doctrine on the right that the ABM treaty is per se bad. I'm hopeful that we're at a place now where the president, if we in fact, and I happen to support significant further reductions in offensive capability, if we get the Joint Chiefs to agree upon a number significantly below where we are, I'm willing to go along with an amendment of the ABM treaty, assuming that we have scrubbed this in a way that we understand what the likely response in China will be to such a system. If, in fact, notwithstanding the fact that the Russians would agree, this will start as significant, and our intelligence agencies published widely, and I can only tell you what was in the paper. I won't confirm, a state was in the paper, that they will do 10 times as much as they would have otherwise done in offensive capability if we build such a system. If we cannot get through that wicket, then it seems to me it is not worth the candle. The cost is not worth it, and the consequence of going forward with the limited benefit that would flow from it may very well start that arms race, which I worry most about in the most dangerous part of the world. It was dangerous before, and it's considerably more dangerous now. For I cannot fathom India sitting by if China rapidly racks up their nuclear capability, and I cannot figure Pakistan doing the same. And so I see it as a disaster. But this is the beginning step. And I guess the polite way of saying it is, I'm happy the president seems to be moving in a direction where he may not unilaterally walk away from the ABM treaty. That's a big deal.
I want to go to Rita next, but if there are other questions on either strategic defense or the ABM treaty, I'll take them now before we leave that topic. If not, we'll go to Rita.
Rita Howes, you didn't mention Iraq. Do you see Iraq in the second stage as a target for the terrorist counteroffensive? And what is your view on the continuation of our policy of sanctions?
I happen to think that the sanctions policy need be changed. I was, and worked with would be an exaggeration, but discussed at length with the Secretary of State a smarter sanctions policy. I happen to agree that I thought he was going in the right direction. I was hoping that it would be embraced, although I now think there's an opportunity to embrace it because the dynamics have changed in Moscow and the dynamics have changed in France and the dynamics have changed in China somewhat, and I would further explore going back to that approach that is a smarter sanctions policy. I'm of the view that what has changed has all been bad from an Iraqi standpoint for the Iraqis. The idea now that we are going to just disregard what Saddam has done, walk away and just seek economic opportunity as some of our friends and allies have done, I think is being reconsidered in those very capitals. Rather than have a second phase the way in which the press uses it, and I assume you're talking about it, that is after we finish with Afghanistan, do we invade Iraq? I think that is not the prudent approach. I think what we attempt to do is to build a coalition, reconstruct a coalition that is tighter and stronger and with more demands placed upon the behavior of Iraq. My view is if we're able to do that and the behavior is still as bad as it has been in the past, you will be able to much more likely generate a consensus on at least standing by as we took action or having multilateral action. But to just go from here to there, I think would be a disastrous mistake in the near term.
Let's go back to that table. I'm going to try to move around the audience as best I can. Yeah, great.
Senator Frank Wisner from the American International Group. The current crisis
Why are you taking
is...
folks out of Delaware? We want to talk about that. I
Not
want to know this, Mr. Ambassador. This is parochial. This is serious stuff.
We have a,
I'm only joking.
we have a commitment to
I
Delaware.
just want to kind of throw you off on that.
All right, sir.
He's not really joking.
Former congressman can tell you I'm worried about it, baby.
Senator, coming back to the subject of your terrific speech today, the
It went from good to terrific.
This crisis has brought to light other tensions, and among them has been the sparking of tension between India and Pakistan, with very heavy Indian shelling, acts of terror in Kashmir. As you look at that aspect of the challenge to American diplomacy, what message do you have to the parties in the region, how they can get on top and the role of the problem they have and the role the United States can play?
Let me answer them in reverse order. The role of the United States. The United States should stay engaged the way the Secretary has gotten engaged in the last week. It's made a difference already. I think there has to be a clear understanding both in Delhi and Islamabad that we are interested, we are looking, and we are watching. Secondly, I think a message should be delivered very strongly to the Indians. Do not attempt to take advantage of this circumstance at this moment. It's against your interest across the board. And thirdly, we have to make clear to the Pakistanis that, notwithstanding the fact we need you very much right now, you are in a position where if you are going to continue to foment the terror that does exist in Kashmir, then you are operating against your own near-term interest, because that very viper can turn on you. And I think we have to talk and 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 engage and engage and engage. Because as you well know, part of the cry and the part of India has been just somebody pay attention, or excuse me, in Pakistan, someone pay attention. And in India, we don't want any part of anybody being involved in looking at any of this problem. The truth of the matter is the whole world is looking at their problem now in Kashmir, not just us. The spotlight is on, and the consequences for how they will be treated relative to all other nations in the world is very much up in the air right now, and they should be made constantly aware of how tenuous the circumstance is for both of them. In this case, particularly India, in my view. Particularly India.
Can I follow up on that myself? Because at the beginning of this administration, the administration seemed to be tilting, to use the term, toward India. The Indian foreign minister was given a meeting with the president, and it seemed as if the administration was going to try to, as one of the cornerstones of their foreign policy, build a much better relationship with India than we'd had in the past. In view of what you just said, do you think that that was then and this is now, or is there still an opportunity going forward to forge a much closer relationship with the Indians?
I think that was then, and it's almost still that way now. And let me explain what I mean by that. I may be mistaken, and I may be a bit cynical, but I think the initial, quote, tilt toward India was related to Beijing more than it was to Pakistan or anything else. And I think that the relationship with Beijing was going south very rapidly and continued to move south in a precipitous way until Powell made his visit. I coincidentally happened to take a small delegation of senators to some very high-level meetings for 6 days in China just on the heels of that visit. And you could literally see, maybe a mild exaggeration, a sigh of relief on the part of the Chinese that maybe this collision is not inevitable. I think it chastened the Chinese a little bit. I think it made them focus on the precipice as well as us. Now what's happened is, I think, you have, and I cannot prove this, I think what you have in India now is a look north and saying, whoa, it looks like these guys are talking again. We may have moved past our opportunity to make a substantial change in the relationship. That would be a mistake on their part to think that, because I think that there is a desire in the administration to actually genuinely better relations with India. I think it is an absolute essential element of American foreign policy that that be done. And part of that is simply engaging them and treating them like what they are. They will not too long be the largest, the most populous nation in the world. They are a democracy, as flawed as you may think it is. They are someone with whom we should and must have a much, much, much better relationship and understanding. And the whole world has changed for India. It has changed not only when the wall came down and when their protector evaporated. It changed now as the relationship with China begins to mature. And they're going to have some great difficulty internally figuring out how to deal with that. But we should be engaged at the highest level on a daily basis. literally with India. So I don't think the administration is jettisoning India, but I think they're beginning to look at India in a different way, not as cynically as just a card to have been played against Beijing.
Questioner behind Frank, then I'm going to try and go to the back of the room for a question.
Mansour Ijaz. Senator, it's always good to hear you speak so frankly, so I'm going to try and get you on the record on another sensitive issue. Does the United States need a military policy to deal with an eventuality in which a Taliban-like force would hold control over Pakistan's nuclear weapons? And if it does, what should that policy look like?
Well, I think we're engaged in that policy right now. And I have every reason to believe from my conversations with the president, and I don't pretend to be his confidant. I don't want anyone, I know you all know that, but the CNN audience might think I'm trying to foist myself off as the president's close advisor. I've been flattered the president has engaged me as the opposition and as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and we've had, as they say, full and frank discussions, probably 5-6 hours worth in the last several months. But my impression and my understanding is, coming from both the Secretary of State as well as the Secretary of Defense and as well as the President of the United States personally, that that is the essence of their policy at the moment. It is reflected in certain ways. You see, and I'll be very parochial and give you a specific example. Right now, there has been and continues to exist a real dissatisfaction on the part of the Northern Alliance that we have not done, which is fully within our capability to do now, and that is with air power, essentially provide air cover that could decimate the Taliban capability of holding them back, not only from Bashar, but also holding them back from the capital. And the president has not been as blunt as I'm going to be, because I don't speak for him, so I can say it. I believe the president's actions have been somewhat circumspect for very good reason. He understands that if, in fact, the Northern Alliance marches into Kabul and sets up a government, that we will have the potential for a disintegration in Islamabad, and that Pakistan may very well, and Musharraf may, in fact, collapse. It may be gone. And so I think that I give you that as one example of my view of the president's understanding of how difficult this is. We have also done things which were not particularly comfortable for me to do, quite frankly. I'm the guy, as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, that was responsible for either facilitating and or proposing the lifting of all the sanctions, of which I have supported relative proliferation, not to proliferation questions, as well as democratization. And we've even lifted Section 508. So my point is that we have taken extraordinary action, which is sort of against our instincts, with only the promise of elections a year from now, the commitment to be there, to be kept, and only the hope that we will be able to stabilize, that the region will, with our help and others, be stabilized in such a way that we don't have to face that god-awful spectrum of radical Islamic group taking over a country that is multiple sizes larger than Afghanistan with nuclear weapons. So I think the administration fully apprised, fully understands, and is doing everything within its power, understanding, and in defense of the administration, no one has a hold card here. No one that I know, maybe some of you do, and if you do, let me know, because I want to nominate you for the Nobel Peace Prize in advance. No one I know has a surefire way to assure that stability in this part of the world will result from the actions undertaken. Conversely, I don't know of anyone who I do know of some. I don't know anyone in this room who's likely to suggest we should not and need not have taken the action we are taking. We're not going to get into the weeds here. It's going to start to get, we talked, I hope I don't offend anybody saying this, at our table here, we talked about how long, not the phrase, this word wasn't used, but how long the honeymoon, how long the unquestioning period of unabashed support for the president's policy will continue. I think everyone, I shouldn't say everyone, I think the vast majority of the foreign policy establishment of the Democratic and Republican sides of the aisle, in fact, share the view that up to now the president has done a pretty darn good job of assembling this multilateral force, resisting what were very strong entrees from parts of administration to bypass Afghanistan and go straight to Iraq, etc. I think he's done well. But now we're going to get into the tough calls. Case in point, and I'll stop with this. How much longer does the bombing continue? because we're going to pay every single hour, every single day it continues, we're going to pay an escalating price in the Muslim world. We're going to pay an escalating price in the region. And that, in fact, is going to make the aftermath of our, quote, victory more difficult to reconstruct the region. Conversely, the president has a very difficult spot. How much does he have to make the environment in which we are going to send, and we will, American forces, hospitable to the extent that it reduces the number of casualties that may, in fact, be a consequence of that action? That's a tough call. I'm not a military man. I can sit there and tell you, though, I hope to God it ends sooner than later, because every moment it goes on, it makes the aftermath problem more severe than it was an hour ago. And so that's what I mean when I say they're fully apprised of their problem. They're going to engage in activities that I may be able to Monday morning quarterback and second guess, but I know of no clear path that suggests how they secure the notion that there is no possibility of Pakistan degenerating into chaos and us dealing with a problem there. The ultimate answer would be, if that were the case, we would find ourselves with a whole hell of a lot more forces in that region than we have now, which would be a very bad idea.
I'm going to go right straight to the back of the room, and then I have a question at the middle table up front.
I'm David Vidal with the Conference Board. Senator, you gave us a picture that was historic, and it raised a question in my mind to this effect. Is there an advertising problem? Is there a genuine insoluble intellectual issue? Or simply have we not solved the following? It seems to me that for the past 50 years or so, the U.S. has always been stuck in a corner. On the one hand, we launch into the world with noble causes, and then we tie ourselves to ignoble regimes so that we have dates for purposes, but people think that we're married to these regimes, and the same thing is occurring now in the Middle East. What's wrong? Why can't we do a dual-track strategy? Why can't we send a message that's credible that we do serve noble purposes on the one hand, but we also do not want to marry ignoble regimes on the other? Why can't we solve that issue?
Because life's tough. They're hard choices. I don't know whether, I don't want to get him in trouble, but I suspect Les Gelb may remember about a dozen years ago my proposing we start to distance ourselves from some of those various regimes. And, for example, during the Gulf War, one of the reasons I voted against the resolution that was put forward was I did not get any commitment from the administration personally that they would, in fact, make sure that when we freed Kuwait, the circumstance in Kuwait would change. I did not see merely putting the emir back in power as anything that inured to our great benefit. The territorial principle of not crossing a border was a big deal and important, and oil mattered. But it seems to me we should have extracted in return for that some commitment toward the movement toward, some movement toward, not outright democracy, but some movement toward a liberalization of the systems. I have been the odd man out on that for a long time with regard to Saudi Arabia as well and other countries in the region. But I acknowledge to you, it is incredibly difficult to do. And you got to be prepared to take a risk. And the risk is serious. The downside is high. The costs economically are severe. But I think we're at a point now where we have to take those risks. But it's not easy. It is not easy, because the truth of the matter is we inherited what was there. We helped make and sustain what was there, but we did it for reasons relating to our immediate self-interest that were of consequence to us, enabling us to do other things in other parts of the world that were necessary to be done. So it's just, as a former president once said, life ain't fair. Well, the world ain't fair, and we're left with a lot of Hobson's choices. If I can elaborate on one piece. This dissemination of information, I put together a proposal that I've been discussing with the administration. I've been sort of the guy who has, and a lot of you have as well, but I mean in the Senate and the House, I've been sort of the godfather of the radios lately, the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, the Voice of America, etc. It's woefully underfunded. For example, in the largest Muslim state in the world, where they have 220 million people, we spend $2 million on the radios, for example. So I put together a proposal at the president's urging, quite frankly, because one of the things I discussed with him that I'm going to present to him when he gets back, that is over a $500 million initial investment and $250 million a year for public diplomacy in fundamentally altering the way in which we're able to broadcast to that part of the world. As part of this, I asked my staff, and I have some very talented staff people who know the region well, have worked in the region, and are very academically qualified as well as practically qualified, if they would get together some of 2 or 3 or 4 of the most knowledgeable folks on Islam in the world, so that we, in fact, when I proposed this, I was not doing something that was counterproductive, so that we wouldn't find we were causing more problems than we were solutions. And I sat with these 4 folks, and I'll tell you what they said to me. Now, they're not the end of the day, but they said to me, they said, look, the idea of winning the hearts and minds of the Islamic world and the Arab Islamic world is not likely. The best you can do is give some reason for the moderates within that regime to have a reason to sustain their position against the extremists in, did I say regime? I meant to say region, against extremists in the region. And they went on to say the problem isn't with the American people, it's with American foreign policy. And then they ticked off the foreign policy, being part of propping up regimes that, in fact, are anti-democratic and are part of the problem. As again, Osama bin Laden is after Riyadh, not after Jerusalem. And it's a different problem. And also they then point out Israel. And they say part of the problem relates to our policy relative to Israel. Well, there's certain things we're not going to change. There's certain things we're not going to change. So the question is, what utility would a significant investment in our public diplomacy have? And it seems to me at a minimum what it would have. It would give a context in which they were able to make judgments about the totality of our actions, and would it not, in fact, change the attitude in that part of the world toward us, but would moderate it. And so these are very difficult questions, though. But I am going to propose we make this major investment, and I think it will fall on, quite frankly, friendly ears in the administration based on my conversation with the President.
Is there an opportunity to take that a step further to the whole foreign policy budget of the government? The United Nations, which you've been involved in, support for our embassies abroad, which have been underfunded for some time, foreign aid budget, is that a part of the whole response?
No, because, and I'm not being... I didn't mean to be so short. I don't mean no.
Short answer,
that's right. No, well, the answer is no for the following reason. For the federal government to engage in public diplomacy at home is a very dangerous thing, in my view. For us to fund news organizations that promote a governmental position, it seems to me, is not what we need domestically in the United States. But we do need it abroad. What will change, and has changed that, as Ambassador Negroponte knows, he not only, I mean, I love the guy. We held him up for God knows how long before we approved him, so everybody made sure any accusation ever against him wouldn't rub off on them, and they all turned out to be false. And we approved him, I think unanimously, wasn't it? I don't think anybody voted against it. And he went up there and did something no one's been able to do, including Prince Holbrooke. No one's been able to do this. And you know what he did? He went up there and got immediately the right-wing Republicans to free up the money in the House. You know what did that? The world changed. They did not want to have to, as former Senator Carol Moseley Braun would say, wear the jacket of us not being able to put together a coalition because he was unable to do his job in the United Nations because he had to face the constant charge that we weren't meeting our end of the deal. So I think events alter those kinds of things, and I think you're going to see foreign policy much more in the front burner of American domestic politics for the reasons that were stated at the outset that will, in fact, up those budgets, and people are beginning to understand the complexity. It's not all military, it's diplomacy. We have to lead in other ways, and I think that will be helped by this terrible circumstance.
Senator Biden,
I still
thanks
think Bruce phase is best.
Hi, I'm Dick Garwin, Counsel on Foreign Relations. Thank you for an insightful and constructive presentation. Now, on the ABM Treaty and missile defense, I can just say amen. But the rest of the topics you mentioned, we need to have not only some priorities, but more than that. The administration and the Congress are going to have to do a number of things together. First, it seems to me that we have to have refugee camps, and the refugee camps have to be training grounds for democracy. So we need to work with the United Nations to do this and to accomplish that. We need to provide security, but we need to provide more than security. The next priority, I think, has to be the Chemical and Biological Weapons Convention, especially the BWC. Essentially, all the nations of the world have signed up, but they're not all obeying it. They're not all doing what they said. Before we have any compliance, we've got to have them say, we're going to do this, we're passing a law, everybody has to stop affiliating with biological weapons, and we're going to destroy our stocks. Seems to me that's the next. And finally, in my talk, is the Pakistani nuclear weapons. You read in the New York Times Bruce Blair saying we ought to provide means of going in and capturing them in case Pakistan regime falls. Well, we'll get a lot more cooperation if we fund Pakistani regime in order to destroy their own or render them ineffective if the regime falls. And with uranium weapons, that can be done in reasonably expeditious fashion. But how do you solve the problem of priorities and doing a number of things at the same time, which neither administrations nor Congress are good at?
Let me tell you, I fully agree with your list. I shortened my speech on the fly here. I'll give you a copy of it. It mentions all three of those things, particularly the biological and chemical weapons treaties and the implementation. And I think you do just what you said. Those discussions are underway with the Democratic Congress and the Republican members of Congress and the President on setting those priorities. The question is, the President has an internal dilemma he has to overcome first. He is focusing on first things first, but then he has to deal with, and I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but he has to deal with what has not gone away. There is, for lack of a better phrase, still a Rumsfeld-Powell split on how they look at the world and how they look at these very issues that you've stated here. I was discussing here at my table my perception, and maybe, what's that old expression, the father is the wish is the father of the thought, or whatever it is, that maybe I'm just sort of making this up as I go along because I want to feel it. But my impression is this president is arriving at his own foreign policy. He is arriving at his own foreign policy. I think he accepted wholesale sort of the movement right position on foreign policy issues because as a governor he hadn't paid much attention to those. And I think he's finding that those as a prescription don't fit the modern day world as easily as he thought they may. And so I see the first thing that has to happen is the president himself has to decide what he thinks about these issues. And I hope we throw in CTBT here, because I think to me that is the single most important thing we could do at the front end. But Vin is looking at his watch, understandably. I happen to agree with you. With regard to priorities, Dick Lugar and I are going to be introducing this week a call for a commission that is, and we got a lot of commissions, but a commission made up, appointed by the President, the House, and the Senate, made up of the leading people in America that we could find with the greatest stature to come forward with us with a threat assessment that in fact reflects for purposes of deciding what priorities we should be focusing on. And so I can talk to you more about that later, but my time is, the hook is going to come.
I don't know if we have time for one or two more, but I have one there, and if there's time for two, it's over there.
I'll do yes or no. Okay.
Les is telling me only one, I'm sorry to say, so it's going to have to be here.
Philip Stalbot. Senator, thank you for this broad-gauged approach to the problems we face. My question is this. Do you foresee the need or the expectation of a congressional declaration of war, which the Constitution calls for, and if so, against whom?
The answer is yes, and we did it. I happen to be a professor of constitutional law. I'm the guy that drafted the use of force proposal that we passed. It was in conflict between the President and the House. I actually was the guy who finally drafted what we did pass. Under the Constitution, there is simply no distinction, as Louis Fishers and others can tell you. There is no distinction between a formal declaration of war and an authorization of the use of force. There is none for constitutional purposes, none whatsoever. And we defined in that Use of Force Act that we passed what, against whom we were moving and what authority was granted to the President. And why don't you take that question? It's not 2 o'clock. I'll give you yes or no. He may be from Delaware.
Roland Paul with Dave Barron Howard. Senator, I concur with everybody else in commending you on your comments, and anyone who's heard you before would certainly not be surprised at how good they were. I would recur to a question you answered earlier. You said as long the bombing every day it goes on the harder it may be for us to do something in the past. What do you see as the situation if we don't defeat the Taliban in the next 4 weeks and winter sets in Afghanistan?
Again, I'm not a military man. I think the American public and the Islamic world is fully prepared for us to take as long as we need to take if it is action that is a mano-mano, if it's us on the ground going against other forces on the ground. The part that I think flies in the face of and plays into every stereotypical criticism of us is we're this high-tech bully that thinks from the air we can do whatever we want to do, and it builds the case for those who want to make the case against us that all we're doing is indiscriminately bombing innocents, which is not the truth. Some innocents are indiscriminately bombed, but that is not the truth. I think the American public is prepared for a long siege. I think the American public is prepared for American losses. I think the American public is prepared, and the President must continue to remind them to be prepared for American body bags coming home. There is no way that you can, in fact, go after and root out al-Qaeda and or bin Laden without folks on the ground in caves risking and losing their lives. And I believe that the tolerance for that in the Islamic world is exponentially higher than it is for us bombing. That's the generic point I wish to make. I am not qualified enough to tell you, although I can tell you what the military guys have said to me, this is not 1948. This is 2001. I'm not at all sure they're correct. And our ability to wage conflict in the winter in parts of this region is within our control. I don't know enough to vouch for that or not, but I do think it clearly makes it more difficult. And the weather window is closing as opposed to the tolerance window for our behavior, in my view. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you. That was wonderful. That was wonderful.
Thank you all.
Coming up on C-SPAN, a couple of updates on anthrax in Washington, D.C., and then our coverage of today's Pentagon